He is one brave so-and-so. He shows up at the studio and then receives wave after wave of response on social media, most of which he gives his undivided indifference to. It is the brilliant Richard Power Sayeed, former Labour official, and Jason Reed, political commentator and UK lead at Young Voices. Now, I'm going to start with you, Richard Power Sayeed. Partygate. Rule breakers are about to be named, and we heard Keir Starmer say, look, if I get a fine, I'll resign. Boris hasn't. Do you think this is getting any political traction, bearing in mind the current economic climate?
So I think we've seen it definitely have an impact on the polls over the last few months. I would expect it to have much less in the coming weeks, as in, you know, I don't think you can just carry on having the same kind of impact from the same story. And as you say, people have heard all of the revelations that there are to be had, we think. We don't think that the Sue Gray report's going to have something particularly new in it. What I think is really important to say, though, is that even if people have stopped caring about a news story because it's got a bit boring, ultimately we are talking about whether our leaders are accountable. And that is such a precious thing in a democracy. It's what our civil liberties are founded on. And whether or not people are entertained by it or not, we've got to try to hold our leaders to account.
Well, I mean, in terms of accountability, he's been subject to a criminal fine. I mean, he's not beyond the law. That's accountability. We still have a democracy which could punish him at the next election by saying this is an important issue of character and we can, you know, vote the blackguards out. So, you know, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. Jason Reed, do you think that this is an instance of leaders not being held to account and therefore offends the fundamental principles of democracy, as Richard does?
I think there's been a change of culture at the top of politics in the last few years and few decades. I think if this had happened 40 or 50 years ago, Boris Johnson would have resigned. I think he should have resigned early on. I think Keir Starmer's made him look like a little bit of a fool by saying that he would resign if he was put in that same position. However, it does seem like he is Teflon Boris, as some people like to call him. Nothing is sticking, and it doesn't seem like he's going anywhere. And so, although I wish he would have resigned at the beginning, I think we may be now reaching the point we should look
Why do you say he should have resigned over this and not, for example, the failure of the economy? And a lot of people feel that although he was a rule breaker, and many people, I'm amongst that malice, that group of people, I never think of the collective noun, that experienced being at arm's length from somebody who died of COVID that you couldn't visit. You know, and I understand the frustration, but when it came to lockdown 2, when a lot of these parties, for example, took place, lots of people were breaking the rules themselves, and they wonder whether or not this is really an issue of character. Why do you say he should have resigned?
Because it's an issue of hypocrisy. This is, as you say, the rules were incredibly harmful in and of themselves, and there are a lot of questions to be asked if and when the inquiry does actually happen into COVID and all the rules that were introduced, whether all of them were necessary and whether some of them did a lot of harm that we did not foresee. But with Partygate, this is an issue of, as you say, people who were unable to see relatives, unable to attend funerals, and they didn't know at the time that the people who set those rules were flagrantly disregarding them. And so, of course, if he had any dignity as a politician, he should have resigned a long time ago, but it's not going to happen now, and I think he will lead the Tories into the next election.
Dignity and politics have gone, Richard Power Sayeed?
He lied about it. That's what matters, right? Breaking rules, getting it wrong, being a hypocrite, these are things that we perhaps expect from Boris Johnson, but even I was surprised by the fact that the Conservative Party thought that him lying to Parliament, lying to the public over and over again about this was not something that they thought was worth kicking him out over. And the very simple reason that they haven't done that is that they don't have a successor lined up. It's pure politics. When Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss looked like more attractive options, they were willing to potentially kick him out. Then they realised that those two were not decent potential prime ministers, and they held back from kicking him out. That is an appalling record for the Conservative Party. It is putting the party before the country. My
money's on Penny Mordaunt, by the way. I hope she comes back into the front line. But Jason Reed just said something earlier which I think is interesting. You know, you said 40 years ago. I think it's a bit closer, but I'm a bit old. You know, if you think about I suppose it is really, certainly 30 years ago, John Major's Back to Basics campaign massively backfired, right? There was Tory party member after Tory party member who was blown off the field by sexual scandal. That's unthinkable now. What do you think that says about modern politics and our expectations of our politicians?
I think our expectations of our politicians are, as you say, they're much lower than they should be. I think we need to hold them to a higher standard. I think people who say that, you know, there's been too much anger over Partygate, or we talk about it too much. Of course there are other issues in the world, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was one that very obviously brought everything into perspective. But that doesn't mean that we should stop holding our politicians to account. And of course the problems with Boris Johnson's government go, as you touched on a moment ago, much, much deeper than Partygate or being ambushed by cake or anything like that. He's a politician who has shown again and again that he has no problem going back on his word and going against the promises that he's made.
So just to be clear, it's not about the private lives of politicians. I think social mores have moved on, where people feel that we don't want to interfere or invade the private spaces of politicians unless, as Richard powerfully puts, it's a hypocritical issue. It's an issue about not honour, not about whether or not they may have a mistress or anything of that kind. It's about whether or not they appear to be one thing but are in fact another. It's about lies, in other words. And whilst there isn't fundamental integrity, we've got a dearth of character in our political class, something to think about and reflect on as we go to break. Listening to Rob Rinder here at the home of common sense on talkRADIO. Good afternoon. It is 5:45 and we're back to our political debate on Talk TV, live from talkRADIO studios, where we've got Richard Power Sayeed, former Labour official, and Jason Reed, political commentator and UK lead at Young Voices. You're very young. Are you young?
How old do you think I am, Rob?
I'd never answer that sort of question. I'm going to say 18 plus VAT.
Well,
now, whilst we think about VAT and the price of living, you know, 9% inflation, it's a really interesting thing to talk about it with young people, because you may not have a lived memory about politicians even really being asked about inflation. You go back to the Thatcher interviews, and nearly every political commentator, and certainly questioner of her, talks about inflation. She often admits that it's too high, 11, 12% interest rates being a sort of critical ingredient to bringing inflation under control. It is an extraordinary thing, and of course it's affected the cost of living, which I think it's generally agreed is going to be a central issue at the next election. And one of the responses to this is to look at poorer communities and, bearing in mind the depletion of resources for our police, for the police to be able to say, there's actually a suggestion of somebody centrally involved in policing, that people that go and shoplift for food shouldn't be prosecuted. Do you think that's going to help the poorest communities, Richard Power Sayeed?
My partner was in the Co-op a couple of days ago, as it happens, and saw somebody getting stopped for not paying for their food. She was a young mum with her kid with her, and he described the terror in her face and the confusion in her little boy's face, and he was thinking, should I go over and try to pay for it? And we were talking about it afterwards, and he was thinking, you know, would there have been a way to pretend that he was with her and she'd made a mistake and help her out? And I just think, like, if your response to somebody not being able to afford to feed their kids is not to want to help them out, but rather is to say, let's punish them, then I think your moral compass is really screwed. You know, we have a government that thinks that we should be prosecuting these people rather than increasing universal credit so that they can afford to buy their kids food. And at the same time, you've got the Chancellor 2 days ago telling big business that he's going to give them tax breaks in the autumn. So it's nothing to do with not being able to afford an increase in universal credit. It's a government that it fundamentally doesn't care about working classes people's lives.
You know, you've brought up a very helpful way of articulating that point, the lived examples. I see them all the time. I to a number of parts of London, you know, and as you know, we've seen a great number of food banks. But I wonder about the central question. I hear you certainly on the second point, the tax break for the rich and the failure adequately to deal with major corporations leaving massive corporate profits offshore. You and I might agree on that. But I do wonder about the example you give, and I think to myself about that mum, whether that was her only option. I know, being brought up by a single mum, in circumstances from time to time where things may have got very, very difficult. The idea that there is a soft bigotry of low expectations on that particular individual, that there was no other option other than to steal is deeply problematic, to use language you might deploy. And also, what I worry about isn't necessarily the co-ops of this world, but if you think to various jurisdictions in America where, for example, they've said we're not going to prosecute shoplifters because of the amount of poverty for goods under £1,000, what that means is that those communities end up becoming underserved. Places like the co-op simply can't be economic. They leave those communities. The high street becomes more decimated. Often it's first citizens, new citizens that have corner shops, for instance, that their livelihoods are destroyed because they don't have access to the rule of law. So it's often the poorest who are most effective where there isn't effective policing. So how on earth is that a useful policy for the poor?
Right, so let's increase universal credit and then people won't need to do this. I mean, you talk about the possibility that people might have other options. I mean, it's very normal in this country to be working multiple jobs, doing 60 hours a week, and still not be able to afford to look after your kids properly because you're being paid so poorly, which is a government decision to not give those people proper wages.
I heard a story yesterday. I was in various reasons I got to say where it was, but I was watching. Well, I can actually. I was watching a court case, and in mitigation, the lawyer stood up. And I'm addressing this to you, Jason Reed, and what I was staggered by is a person had made some poor choices. He'd worked every single day in lockdown, 3 jobs as a delivery driver, and still struggled to make ends meet, to say the very least. You know, that's something that we need to reflect on, that's going to undoubtedly interfere or should influence what happens at the next election. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, we are not doing anywhere near enough, and stories like the one Richard told are far too common at the moment, of people being unable to put food on the table, unable to pay their bills. It's very clear that having a £150 council tax rebate and a £200 loan on your energy bills is not anywhere near enough to give people the help they need with, as you say, inflation so high and the cost of living crisis only going to get worse. That does not mean that decriminalising theft is a sensible thing to do. The rule of law has to apply universally to everyone. This is part of the reason people were so angry about Partygate.
But would you agree with me that actually by removing police from those communities, you're actually going to do more violence to those communities and make them poorer and less able to feed themselves? I
do agree, yes. They rely in many... Well, everyone relies on the police to keep us safe. All communities do. And exactly as you say, taking away... you know, you'd steal from Peter to pay Paul, don't you? You might let someone else off for shoplifting, but then the owner of the corner shop loses out and loses their livelihood, exactly as you were saying.
Or places like, there are other places you could shop, but like the co-op you're referring to, there are benefits of economy of scale, which means they can make things cheaper for people. If they disappear from communities because they can't restock the shelves, because there's no way of protecting the goods there, in other words, if the message goes out, don't worry, we won't prosecute you or hold you to account, and they disappear, it does make shopping even more expensive for people because they have only access to corner shops where, frankly, things cost more.
Well, look, you're the legal expert, so you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I understand that it's a completely normal thing for police, prosecutors, and indeed judges, when they're sentencing, to use discretion based on motive. And the idea that because you can't allow constant and total theft in shops, therefore you wouldn't allow mitigating circumstances to, you know, create a situation where a young mum who's trying to feed her kids wouldn't get prosecuted for stealing some food. I mean, like, it doesn't have to be extended to the logical extreme. That's not how policy works.
Let me just help you out, right? So that poor woman that you're referring to, the woman that was trying to feed her kids, stole something, and the horror of her being stopped, right? Now, we don't know how many times she did it, we know nothing about her. But in those circumstances, both the shop and the police officer, listening to this woman's motives, assuming that, as you should perhaps, that her situation was wholly authentic and she did it that once, they would take, they'd apply discretion in any event, you would hope. Let's move on, because I have to say it's connected, but it's about wealth. Now, you'll recall Peter Mandelson, not sure if he's a mate of yours, saying that he was decidedly relaxed about the ultra-wealthy. I have to say, I take a similar view, not least because they invite me from time to time to their lovely country houses and I want them to be my friend, but also because I do buy this. I don't buy trickle-down economics, but I do buy the idea that you need to have have an economy that is sufficiently capable of creating a climate where there is an entrepreneurial spirit, where those who work the hardest, perhaps doesn't always apply, but those who have a great idea and build a company are frankly able to exist in a country that does what it can to create a tax climate where it's attractive enough for them to continue to do that. It encourages growth, and that enables the tax take to be bigger and pay for the things that we're talking about, prevent poverty. That seems to be a sort of rational way of looking at it. So, for example, the 90% tax rate in the 1970s was a disaster. Now, asking that with that long throat clearing, we look at the Times Rich List, you know, and I wonder whether, A, it's outdated and sensitive, and what it says about our current tax policy. What do you think, Richard Power Sayeed?
Well, you know, I think it's an interesting point you're making about entrepreneurship. Actually, if we compare the different countries of the world, we see that the countries that are most meritocratic, the ones where working hard and being skillful means that you'll succeed, they're also the most equal countries. And that makes sense, right? Because if you're going to school on an empty stomach, you're not going to be able to learn. Whereas if you're going to school and then your parents can pay for a tutor in after school, then you're probably going to do better. So
the countries where there's the biggest equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but that's what matters.
The equality of opportunity comes from the equality in the first place. If you've got a generous welfare system, if you've got rent caps so that people can afford to pay for the roof over their heads, if you've got an energy system which is either nationalised or regulated properly so that people can afford to heat their homes, then you won't have kids going to school hungry, you won't have people struggling to get the training that they need in order to do their jobs better. Equality of opportunity comes from equality, and what we've seen with the Sunday Times Rich List, the fact that we've got a chancellor who's on it this time, and at the same time is giving tax breaks to the super rich, rather to big business, I should say, that is a sign of a fundamentally sick society. And we know that people see this. We know that people understand that this country is stacked against them unfairly, and
Jason
it doesn't
Reed,
have to be that way.
You've got the last 30 seconds. I have to say, I'm not sure if you've written that speech for Keir Starmer, but it's better than anything he's said in the last 12 months. I hope he's listening. Do carry on.
Well, I think that we've seen time and time again throughout history, economic growth is the only way to lift, make people less poor, and we have ample evidence that shows that. The Sunday Times Rich List, you know, it might be outdated and insensitive. You might even call it a socialist endeavour because it's about transparency among wealth. If you took it away, we would know less about the people at the top. But pointing at billionaires, like many people on the left do, and saying their money would be a solution to all our problems is not a wise way of going.
Well, I'm just angry, frankly, everybody, because I'm not on it. And just to be clear, Judge Judy would be. I can't tell you how unhappy it is. It's been a delight to listen to Richard Power Sayeed, Jason Reed. This is Talk TV live from the Talk Radio studio, and it is 5:56, and you're listening to me, Rob Rinder, at the home of common sense.